We told you to get them out of here!
They're staying, and that's the end of it.
The morning the town of Dry Fork tried to run 2 Apache sisters out on foot, Caleb Whitfield was the only man who stepped off the boardwalk instead of turning his back. Nettie and her younger sister Anna stood in the dust outside the mercantile, a single canvas bundle between them, while the sheriff's deputy read out an order that had no signature and no law behind it, only the town council's fear dressed up as decision. Anna, no older than 12, gripped her sister's sleeve so tight her knuckles had gone the color of bone. Nettie did not look down at the ground the way the crowd seemed to expect. She looked straight ahead, chin level, as if daring the wind itself to move her first. Caleb had ridden into Dry Fork an hour earlier for nothing more than horseshoe nails. He had no stake in the sisters, no history with them, nothing that should have made their trouble his trouble. But he had spent 11 years learning exactly what it felt like to be judged by people who had never once asked his name, and something about the deputy's paper, blank where a law should have been, turned his stomach in a way he couldn't ignore. "Where do you figure they're supposed to go?" Caleb asked, loud enough that the crowd's murmuring stopped cold. The deputy's eyes narrowed. "Ain't your concern, Whitfield." Making it mine, Caleb said. No one in Dry Fork had ever heard Caleb raise his voice for anyone. He kept to himself, worked his small stretch of land alone, and gave the town little reason to think of him at all. So when he walked toward the sisters instead of away from them, the silence that fell over the street was not the silence of agreement, it was the silence of people trying to decide who to be angry at. The question that hung in the air, unanswered, was simple and enormous. What had these 2 sisters actually done to deserve banishment, and what would it cost the one man willing to ask? Caleb Whitfield had not always been a man who worked alone. 3 winters back, fever had taken his wife and infant son within 4 days of each other, and the ranch that once rang with 2 voices had gone quiet enough to hear his own boots on the porch boards at night. He had rebuilt himself the only way he knew, 1 fence post, 1 sunrise, 1 silent task at a time, and in doing so had learned a rule he lived by without ever saying it aloud: a man's worth isn't in what people say about him. It's in what he does when nobody's watching to give him credit. Nettie, for her part, had learned her own version of that same lesson, though it had been beaten into her by circumstance rather than grief. She and Anna were the last of their family after a raid 3 years prior had scattered what remained of their band. An aunt in Dry Fork had taken them in until the aunt herself passed of consumption that spring, leaving the sisters with a small adobe house, a debt neither of them understood, and a town that had tolerated their aunt only because she kept to herself and paid on time. With the aunt gone, the debt had transferred, by whose authority, no one could quite say, to the town council, who decided it was simpler to erase the problem than to solve it. A rumor took root that the sisters had been stealing feed from the livery, a rumor with no witness and no proof, only the convenient shape of an excuse. Caleb didn't know any of this yet. All he knew, standing in the street that morning, was that 2 frightened people were being pushed toward the horizon with nothing but a bundle and a lie, and that no one else intended to stop it. He walked the sisters back toward the shade of the mercantile awning, put himself between them and the crowd, and said the only thing he could think to offer. "Whatever this is," he said quietly, "it's got a story behind it. And stories deserve to be heard before they're punished for." It was the first kindness either sister had been shown in Dry Fork since their aunt's funeral, and Anna, still gripping her sister's sleeve, allowed herself, for the first time that morning, to breathe. The council did not appreciate being questioned, least of all by a man they'd written off as a grieving recluse with no say in town matters. Within the hour, word had spread that Caleb Whitfield was harboring thieves, and by afternoon the mercantile owner refused to sell him nails, the feed store refused his coin, and a boy no older than 10 was sent to spit near his boots and call him a name Caleb chose not to repeat. Caleb said nothing in his own defense. He simply loaded what little he'd managed to buy elsewhere onto his wagon, rode out to the sisters' small adobe house, and began doing the only thing that had ever solved anything in his life: work. He mended the collapsing edge of their roof before the coming rains could ruin it further. He split enough firewood to last a hard month. He said little, and asked for nothing, and Nettie, who had expected charity to come with a price she hadn't yet named, watched him from the doorway with a wariness that slowly, day by day, gave way to something closer to trust. "You don't owe us this," Nettie told him one evening, handing him a cup of water as he set down his hammer. "Didn't say I owed it," Caleb answered. "Said it needed doing." She studied him a long moment. "Town's going to make you pay for it." "Town's already trying," he said simply, and went back to work. What Nettie did not yet know was how far the town intended to go. The council convened that same week and voted, quietly, without posting notice, to seize the sisters' adobe house entirely under the same unproven debt, giving them 10 days to vacate for good. When the notice finally reached Caleb's hands instead of the sisters directly, delivered by a deputy who seemed almost ashamed to hand it over, Caleb read it twice before folding it into his coat pocket. Anna, watching him from across the yard, asked the question neither adult wanted to answer aloud. "Are they going to win?" Caleb knelt to meet her eyes. "Not if I've got anything to say about it." Caleb spent 3 sleepless nights going through his late wife's old ledger box, searching for the one thing he suspected the council was counting on no one ever finding, the original paper their aunt had signed. He found it folded behind a stack of unrelated bills at the land office, where a clerk who owed him an old favor let him look without asking too many questions. The debt, it turned out, had been settled in full 8 months before the aunt's death. The council's claim wasn't just cruel. It was fiction, built on a debt that no longer existed. He rode straight to the council meeting the next evening, paper in hand, and walked into a room that had already decided he didn't belong in it. The council chairman barely looked up from his desk. "This doesn't concern you, Whitfield. Made it my concern the day you tried to run 2 children out of town on a lie," Caleb said, and set the paid receipt down on the desk hard enough that every man in the room went quiet. The room did not erupt into apology. It went colder, the way rooms do when people realize they've been caught rather than corrected. The chairman threatened to have Caleb's own grazing rights revoked for stirring trouble. Another councilman muttered that a man who sided with Apache girls over his own town had no place complaining about consequences. Caleb had known, riding in, that proving the truth would not be the same as winning it back peacefully. He had a choice now: walk away with his name clean and his land safe, or push further and risk losing both. He thought of Nettie's chin held level in the dust that first morning. He thought of Anna's small hand gripping her sister's sleeve. "Then revoke it," Caleb said quietly. "I'd rather lose land I can rebuild than live next to a town that steals a home out from under 2 orphaned girls and calls it justice." It was the Reverend's wife, seated quietly at the back of the room and until then unheard, who finally stood and broke the silence that followed. She said she had watched the sisters keep that house clean and paid for 3 years running, and she would not sit by while good men turned into thieves wearing badges of respectability. One by one, the room's certainty cracked. By the time Caleb rode home that night, the council's order had been rescinded, and the paper debt buried where it belonged, in the past, unpaid because it had never truly existed. By the following spring, the roof Caleb had mended held strong through every storm the season threw at it, and the adobe house that once stood on the edge of eviction stood instead at the edge of something new, a small, shared ranch, fences mended, garden growing, 3 names now etched instead of 1 on the property deed the land office finally corrected. Anna had taken to calling Caleb by a name that made him go quiet every time he heard it, not out of discomfort, but because it was the first time in 3 years anyone had called him family. Nettie no longer watched him from doorways with wariness. She sat beside him on the porch most evenings instead, the two of them saying little, the way people do when silence has finally become comfortable rather than lonely. Caleb often thought back to that rule he'd lived by since the winter he lost everything: a man's worth isn't in what people say about him. It's in what he does when nobody's watching to give him credit. He understood now that it had never just been a rule for grief. It had been a rule waiting for 2 sisters standing in the dust, chin level, refusing to look away, waiting for a reason to matter again. If you were in Caleb's shoes, would you have stepped between the crowd and the sisters that morning, knowing it could cost you everything you'd rebuilt?